I'll send out everything. You'll know what your midterm is by the end of the day. Okay? But these are the three moral struggles I chose last term. Those wolves in Isle Royale are just fascinating. I didn't give you the full story on that, but they're wolves. It's the longest humans have been studying moose predation on moose by wolves since I think since the late 50s. And it's an ongoing, right? Now there are only 3 wolves left, and they're not reproducing, so this study is about to come to an end. It's kind of sad, really. And the superintendent of Isle Royale has refused to bring in more wolves from Canada. But the moose made it there in the early 1900s, and has set up residence there. And moose are big, and moose are tough for any animal to take down, and wolves have to learn how to do it, and they have to cooperate, right? Moose they can kick, and they're really big, and they're really strong, and they're angry. They get angry really easily, and they could easily kill a wolf with one kick. So it's a tricky thing, right? Anyway, those wolves. So the moose showed up, and we don't know, right? We humans. European American humans who keep records didn't arrive until I think the early, maybe late 1700s. But they only lived there seasonally, fishermen and loggers and stuff like that, because you can't live there in the wintertime. But there were no wolves there, and there were no moose there, right? Until the late 1800s, early 1900s, the moose started showing up, and then they started spreading. They found this whole big 40-mile long island, right, filled with wonderful lush vegetation that they like to eat. So they set up this, and at one time there were, I think, 3,000 wolves on this not wolves, 3,000 moose, right? There were a lot of moose. They multiplied. But anyway, there were no wolves there until 1949. Very interesting. The year after Aldo Leopold died. And when Aldo Leopold recommended, Isle Royale was made a national park, I think in 1931, right? And Leopold was, very aware of it, and I think he probably traveled there and visited and stuff. And he recommended that wolves be introduced, because he knew there were all these moose there, and he recommended it, but nobody paid attention to him, took it seriously. But then sure enough, the year after he died, some wolves crossed the ice bridge, right? There was an ice bridge. And then they set up, hey man, this is great, look at all those moose, right? And they learned how to hunt those moose, and they thrived. And within 20 years, by the late 60s, there were 5 different packs, and about 60 animals. And then canine parvovirus was introduced by some dogs, some human dogs. Wolves are very sensitive to this, and it generally kills them. So it killed a lot of this parvovirus. Anyway, from the late 1960s, their numbers started plummeting. And right now they suffer from severe inbreeding, right? Somebody the superintendent probably should have brought some more wolves in a long time, like 20 years ago, before they started crashing. Now, if they do bring in wolves now, then unfortunately, those wolves are going to have to learn on their own how to hunt moose. And because in Canada, they hunt caribou. The wolves in Canada eat caribou. So whatever wolves come across from Canada to Isle Royale have to learn how to hunt moose. It's a totally different situation. Anyway, and sadly enough, now those wolves that know how to do that, right? That's in there. Right? They learn. They pass it on to their offspring. But if they had brought in new wolves, 20 years ago, then they could have learned, right? Those new ones would have learned from the old ones. Hopefully, they would have accepted each other. There's some question now. Wolves do not share they don't even share our sense of intra-species, right? If a wolf comes into another pack's territory, that wolf will probably be killed. It happens in Yellowstone all the time. There are about 6 different packs in Yellowstone, and they each have their own territory, right? Anyway, but we don't do that, right? We wouldn't kill another human. Maybe our ancestors did, if he was from a different tribe, but wolves do that all the time. So maybe wolves aren't fully moral, but they have their own sense of morality too. All right, so enough of that. Wait, is that the end of it? What happened to? I know I've got a much more slides here.
You're still on E.O. Wilson's slide.
Yeah, I know. Wilson's coming up here. Wait, no. Oh, Wilson was above all this, wasn't it? That's right. Okay, sorry. Okay, so I like to pair Wilson with Schweitzer. I know they're totally unrelated, and Schweitzer is this guy who, let's below here. Schweitzer has this pretty overtly Christian, it's not any kind of conservative Christian, it's, very progressive, kind of mystical interpretation of the Gospels. But obviously E.O. Wilson has no patience with anything like that. E.O. Wilson's straight up, child of the Enlightenment, science all the way, very skeptical of any kind of questionable metaphysical commitments, Darwinist all the way. E.O. Wilson is a good example of a scientist who takes up moral philosophy as an amateur and ends up kind of working through a strictly Darwinist reading of what all of our moral norms amount to, all right? E.O. Wilson is a sociobiologist, all right? And the leader, the founder of sociobiology, the guy that people look up to, the guy that when scientists take it upon themselves to do some moral philosophy without having, 20 years after taking a single philosophy class as an undergraduate, maybe in critical thinking or something, they all of a sudden take it upon themselves to do moral philosophy without any training at all, and then they trot out this scientific reductionism, and then they say, okay, that's what sociobiology says. Sociobiology says that all social behaviors, including and in particular, and above all, morality, moral norms, right? Where do moral norms come from? They are genetically encoded in us. They benefit the human animal, okay? Ultimately, they even benefit the human individual, because it's to the human individual's benefit that the human individual behave altruistically, right? It's purely selfish for me to go rushing into the burning building, according to the sociobiologist, because I'm saving my own genes, right? Even though I'm dying, I'm saving my genes, and that's right. That's the sociobiologist's answer to the question of what I call the originary question, right? Because they're so committed to science, they have to understand human morality in strictly scientific, consequentialist, reductionistic terms, okay? And that's a big mistake, and I just kind of wish that E.O. Wilson had just gotten schooled up a little bit, studied some Kantianism, studied some utilitarianism, but he makes all these really big assumptions that drive his argument. And I'm very critical of some of those big assumptions, but I like to throw him in there with Schweitzer. Schweitzer's kind of schlocky too, right? I'm not holding up Schweitzer as superior to Wilson. Wilson, for one thing, is a radical environmentalist. If you look at the policies that he has proposed in his long career as a biologist, he's been very influential. This that I asked you to read is a chapter from his book, Biophilia, which came out, I think, in 1982 or 83. And he's still alive, and he's still out there, and he's still getting some attention. Most recently, I think 2 years ago, he got a lot of attention because he called for, didn't just call for, he released this plan to set aside 40% of Earth's land surface for the preservation of biodiversity. Biodiversity he's dedicated his entire life. And other chapters in that book, in Biophilia, he describes his childhood. And it's really kind of amazing. But he has this lifelong love of animals and this lifelong fascination with nature. He writes about how when he was young, he was fascinated with catching snakes, and he caught all these poisonous snakes. It's amazing that he even survived. But anyway, all right. So politically, I myself, as something of a radical environmentalist, can't help but think, well, this E.O. Wilson guy, he's courageous and he's saying the right things policy-wise, but in terms of the ethic that he offers us, I find it lacking and just not very sophisticated at all. All right, but let's just go ahead and go through it. Again, Charles Darwin, right? Wilson's a Darwinist. According to Darwin, morality evolved as a survival mechanism. Okay, moral judgments consist of feelings. Feelings, that's very important, right? For someone who wants to interpret moral norms as being genetically encoded, biologically encoded in the human animal, feelings are not, right? Feelings are biological, whereas concepts, ideas are not, right? Kant says the seat of moral judgment is reason alone, right? The Humeans say the seat of moral judgment is feeling. Feelings of approval and disapproval, which are rooted in biological and emotional responses, okay? Moral judgments are always anthropogenic. They're generated. You have to have a human being to generate moral judgments. Anthropocentric, right? The whole idea is to do things to orient ourselves toward the long-term survival of the human community. Not the whale community, not the dolphin community in Tai Chi Cove. No, the human community, okay? And consequentialist, right? It's all about, well, what do we do now to benefit ourselves in the long run? Moral norms, okay, so Darwin is, and this is why I suggest that perhaps if we want to answer the originary question about where moral norms come from, in a Darwinian way, then perhaps we're committing ourselves to an anthropocentric axiology, all right, and a metaphysic. And if that commitment rubs me, which it does, the wrong way, then I want to say, well, wait a minute now, what's wrong with this answer to the originary question, and what other alternatives could there be, right? If the originary question locks us up into an anthropocentric reservation, and I'm sensing that my connection to the natural world is far deeper and more profound than that. I'm not just thinking about my grandchildren and stuff. I'm thinking about the beauty of this awesome thing here that I'm beholding, right? Then, and so I want to say, well, Darwinists don't get this right. There's something else going on here. And we're going to try to figure out what that something else might be. But for the Darwinists, moral norms are evolutionarily selected social rules that help facilitate the long-term survival and flourishing of human communities, right? They're restrictions on individual liberty that benefit, right? Bad for individuals, but good for the long-term whole, okay? Humans are social animals like wolves, dolphins, and most other mammals. Acquisition of food and other necessities is dependent on cooperative action, right? So those are vital things. You need food, you need to defend yourself against other threats and animals and hurricanes and whatnot, floods. And you can only do those things as a group. Humans are pathetic and weak as individuals. They have strength as a group, right? So those human groupings which have stronger bonds of morality among them are going to survive, right? And those human groupings where people just treat each other like Donald Trump or something, then they're going to die out, right? So there you go. There's a nice Darwinian evolutionary account of the emergence of moral norms, all right? Sentiments of kinship and camaraderie, codified and reinforced in moral norms, increase the survival chances of social groups by enhancing cooperation among individual members. Okay? Okay, and then this explains, and then, here we kind of pick up Leopold's analysis. This is what he says, right? Over many millennia, moral sentiments and norms reinforced, gradually extended, right? This is gradually extended to an ever-widening circle of individuals, eventually including all human beings and even domestic animals. Okay? David Hume, interestingly enough, he stated that most domestic animals are members of our moral community because they share proto-moral sentiments. Okay? When a dog does something that he knows somehow has been taught, or it doesn't matter whether the dog's been taught or not. The dog does something wrong, he cowers, his or her body language exhibits shame and guilt, right? And that's what we do, that's what humans do. And that makes up our moral community. Our moral community consists of sentimental interconnections, right? So when we observe a dog caring about us, and we care about the dog, and we exhibit sentimental attachments to each other, then we are part of the same moral community. Okay? And so Darwin comes along. Seems like Hume's theory is based on moral sentiments, right? Humean moral psychology is perfectly consistent with Darwinian evolution, right? And Darwin's evolutionary counterpart, which is why Collicutt, right, likes to talk about this Hume, Smith, Darwin, Leopold line of moral reasoning. All right. Okay, so interestingly enough, though, this Darwinian account of evolution commits us to the view that yes, wolf packs do have a morality. Okay? Although the content of a wolf pack morality differs significantly from the content of human morality. Right? We don't kill foreigners, they do. The form of wolf pack morality is identical to the form of human morality. Both are biologically and emotively based, right? Because we're animals, right? Is what the Darwinists insist on. We're animals. And so if we do have moral impulses, they have to be based on something animal, like our biology, our emotions, right? Just like with the wolves. In the wolves and in the humans, right? The content of our morality, right? In the case of the wolves, the content of their morality is that there's a foreign wolf, let's go kill it, right? That too is evolutionarily selected to promote long-term survival and flourishing, just like our sense of cooperation, right? Okay, wolf pack moral judgments are wolfgenic, wolf-centric, and consequentialist, right? Like wolves, under Darwin's theory, humans judge things in nature to be morally valuable only if they benefit the long-term interests of the human community. For both wolves and humans, I'm just representing their view, okay? This is all up for question. For both wolves and humans and all other species, nothing in nature is intrinsically valuable, okay? Nothing in nature is intrinsically valuable. We value things in nature, if you're a Darwinist, only because it benefits us in the long term, right? Okay, the systematic study of the biological, that's how E.O. Wilson defines sociobiology. The systematic study of the biological basis of all social behavior. The basic idea is that all social behavior, including especially moral judgments, can be fully explained in terms of biological and ecological conditions. Our passions and toil are enabling mechanisms to continue our existence unbroken, unsullied, and progressively secure. Right? Sounds just like what Darwin said. It is for ourselves and not for any abstract morality that we think into the distant future. All right? What's an example of the abstract morality? Which he's deriding. All right? The tone of this comment is kind of like the tone of Baxter's comment about Henry David Thoreau's Walden Pond. Right? It's a dismissive kind of comment. Right? It is for ourselves. Not for any abstract morality, like the Kantians want to say, like the Schweitzerians want to say, right? Schweitzer gives us an abstract morality, right? An absolute morality, a universal morality, like Kant gives us, right? And E.O. Wilson says, no, none of that is happening. We're just animals, okay? And it is for ourselves and not for any abstract morality that we think into the distant future. For if the whole process of our life is directed toward preserving our species and our personal genes, right, which is what they say, preparing for future generations is an expression of the highest morality of which humans are capable. And then he goes on from there, and what the concept of biophilia serves for Wilson is it serves to deepen this essentially selfish account of how moral norms emerge. And he's telling us, okay, yes, we're all selfish. We're horribly selfish animals, but we're also intelligent and we can understand things. Okay? And if we really understand what's in our selfish interest, then we will preserve biodiversity, because that's in our selfish interest. Right? And he has a hard time. He doesn't spend very many pages because he doesn't really know how to defend that kind of claim. But we can help him. Wilson accepts Darwin's account of the origin and nature of moral reasoning, anthropogenic, anthropocentric, consequentialist, measured through sentiments of approval and disapproval. Wilson accepts that all moral norms, including, for example, moral norms about the impropriety of destroying biodiversity, which is his big moral norm. That's the big moral norm that he wants to champion. Right? And in as many ways as he can. We ought not destroy biodiversity. That's his message, right? That's the message of his life. And he says, even this norm evolves and comes to be accepted as because it serves human survival and human flourishing. Okay? The only plausible and the only effective environmental ethic will be a surface ethic based strictly on human self-interest. And then, in another cringe-worthy moment, he cites what is Gerhard Harden, a sociologist or an economist. He's the guy that, I had tremendous respect for Gerhard Harden too. He's the guy that came up with the tragedy of the commons. But he's not a philosopher, he's not a moral philosopher, he's not trained in philosophy. And so we got E.O. Wilson, all right, hey, I'm going to do moral philosophy and I'm going to cite Gerhard Harden. All right, great. We need to apply, and this is all, right? He doesn't defend any of this stuff about how humans are essentially selfish. He doesn't make any effort to. He just kind of smuggles it in and says, you know, just kind of presents that as gospel. We need to apply the first law of human altruism, ably put by Gerhard Harden. Never ask people to do anything they consider contrary to their own interests. The only way to make a conservation ethic work is to ground it in ultimately selfish reasoning, but the premises must be of a new and more potent kind. An essential component of this formula is the principle that people will conserve land and species fiercely if they foresee a material gain for themselves, their kin, and their tribe. By this measure alone, the diversity of species is one of Earth's most important resources. All right? So then he presents some obvious arguments about the potential benefits that he brings up this library of unread books argument, right? Again, several people, that's a very popular metaphor among species preservationists. Every species is like a library of unread books. He even takes the metaphor farther, though, doesn't he? He says, right, he's promoting in 1983, he's promoting genetic modification, right? Genetically modifying organisms to benefit humans and to save other species, right? So he wants to talk about a library of unexamined loose leaf notebooks, right? That's really what he's saying. Every species is a library of unexamined loose leaf notebooks. Because those geneticists are so clever nowadays, they can look at one species and take out genes, right? And then mix them up and put them over here, right? Loose leaves, right? Take leaves out of the notebook and supplement other notebooks. And then pretty soon you've got a super notebook, right? That can cure cancer, that can feed the world, right? And we don't know until we study these things. And most of these species have never been studied. So again, like Leopold, he would say, the intelligent tinkerer saves all the parts. All right, say the intelligent librarian saves all the loose leaf notebooks. Okay? So E.O. Wilson, again, takes his lessons from biology and ecology and tries to construct a deepened anthropocentric selfish ethic using some of the lessons that we have learned from biology and ecology. Biology and ecology teach us that total freedom with respect to land, air, water, wildlife is not compatible with long-term human survival and flourishing. The sciences of biology and ecology teach us that human society needs to adapt new moral norms governing our relationship with land, air, water, and wildlife. All right, so the biophilic conservationist bridge, again, we're getting to that, you know, how do they defend their moral norms? Well, this seems to me how they do it. They make empirical statements to the effect that destruction of biodiversity is incompatible with long-term human survival and flourishing, okay? Therefore, their normative statement, the destruction of biodiversity is morally wrong. Okay? Pretty simple, right? Scientists teach us what we didn't know before, that biodiversity is essential to human flourishing. How is it essential to human? Again, he points out these different examples, right? The different kinds of food plants and stuff that, all these agricultural, pharmaceutical, fuel benefits, right? But his argument for protecting biodiversity, even where these human benefits don't exist, is much more esoteric and vague. And these are right. I mean, nobody would disagree with if a certain species is discovered to provide tremendous scientific knowledge benefits or aesthetic enjoyments or agriculture, fuel, right? Then yes, we should do everything we can to try to preserve it. But what about those instances where very little species offers very little? And here is where Wilson wants to make these more esoteric arguments about how what he seems to be saying is that even though we don't physically interact with very many of these animals that he's concerned with saving, nevertheless, culturally and intellectually and emotionally, maybe he would even say in our dreams, there are so many myths and stories, and beyond that, he's a scientist, he's not interested in myth and story. He's not going to give us any kind of metaphysical, mystical defense of saving species, but he's going to say that the human mind evolved in the context of rich biodiversity on Earth, and he seems to be saying that loss of biodiversity amounts to loss of the human mind. Loss of human culture, loss of the human mind at so many different levels. All right? So he's trying to make this, it seems to me that he's struggling a little bit in his work. He's struggling to articulate a consequentialist argument. for. And so he has to add these difficult to verify, impossible to verify, right? How would you verify that statement? Loss of biodiversity results in loss of human intellectual resources. I don't know. Don't we have all this stuff on computers already? Don't we? Is that, no? Come on. And is that really why? Why we want to save? Because they're good for us? Surely environmentalists are saying something more than that. But this is Wilson's deep conservation ethic, for what it's worth. He says it's time to invent moral reasoning of a new and more powerful kind, to look to the very roots of motivation and understand why we cherish and protect life. Notice the psychologistic impulse of this thinker here, to look to the very roots of motivation and understand why. It's not really doing moral theory. He's doing something closer to psychology. The elements from which a deep conservation ethic might be constructed include the impulses and biased forms of learning loosely classified as biophilia, ranging from awe of the serpent to the idealization of the savannah and the hunter's mystique. They are the poles toward which the developing mind most comfortably moves. And as the mind moves, it grows into a form true to its long, unique evolutionary history. The more the mind is fathomed in its own right as an organ of survival, the greater will be the reverence for life, for purely rational reasons. So there is this sense in which biophilia as a concept kind of echoes, doesn't mirror the notion of reverence for life. And he even uses this phrase. I don't know if he's even aware that this phrase was used by Albert Schweitzer. For purely rational reasons. All right, so he seems to be unconsciously moving beyond consequentialist arguments, right? When he says purely rational reasons, now he's starting to sound like a Kantian. Now he's starting to sound like a neo-Kantian. Right? The neo-Kantians say it's the aha, the wonder, disclosed by biology and ecology that leads us to understand that these beings, these ecological wholes, these species, have moral status of their own, right? Sure, we can follow, the consequentialist argument, and we can realize that that's just bad news for us if we wipe out these animals, right? But these animals are just awesome. And the neo-Kantians say that they elicit obligations the moment we understand their awesomeness, right? Biology leads to reverence for life. Again, that's what Schweitzer's saying. That's what E.O. Wilson is saying. Biology leads to reverence for life and to the idea that we should protect biodiversity for purely rational reasons. What does that mean, purely rational? Purely empirical? Is that the opposite of that? I don't know. Why, in what sense, does an evolutionary understanding of the human mind lead to greater reverence? Right? Why? He hasn't explained this. Why does an evolutionary understanding of the human mind lead to greater reverence for all of the species? He says, that the human mind evolved in a biophilic context. We evolved to love nature, right? That's what he's saying. But that's not an empirically verifiable claim, is it? We evolved to love, but perhaps it is, but it requires a lot more study. And right now, the biophilia hypothesis is just a hypothesis. It's not even a theory. But I propose a new science, and I think maybe this is what E.O. Wilson is proposing. And I would call that new science biophiliology. And it would be an inquiry into the sentimental interconnections between humans and the natural world. It would be an inquiry into how, in these non-tangible ways, right? I mean, we know we need clean water, clean air, clean food in the future. We need medicine. We need things that all kinds of animals might offer us, right? And those are good reasons too. But Wilson's saying something more than that. It's not just the library of unread books that we're protecting. It's the context in which human beings develop to the magnificence that they enjoy today, right? And so if we degrade that context, then we're somehow, he thinks the consequences of degrading, it's not tangible, but we're losing our minds. Kind of what he's saying. We're losing our minds because our minds are intimately connected with all these other life forms. Okay? And I admit, it seems like a strange argument, especially given Wilson's insistence that the mind is purely an organ of survival, which it has to be if you're a Darwinian, right? So we're in trouble. And we end up, what does E.O. Wilson offer us in the final analysis? He offers us an anthropocentric, even worse than that, it's just a prudential. It's a prudential argument, it's not really an environmental ethic, right? It might be, I mean, it all depends on what your definition of ethic is. But from the way I understand an ethic, an environmental ethic is predicated on, one essential predicate of an environmental ethic is the view that natural entities have their own value. And E.O. Wilson seems to foreclose the possibility of thinking about land, air, water, wildlife, ecosystems, earth as having anything like intrinsic value. Okay? But he is making a very strong argument for humans being selfish and selfishly going around and preserving, right, as much wildlife as possible. He thinks that's the most selfish thing we could do. Isn't that fascinating? You know, most communities around the world that are struggling to survive and busy cutting down their forests would probably disagree, right? They think they're cutting down their forests. They're being selfish by doing that. They probably feel bad about it. But anyway, it's an odd argument, this biophilia. But there is promise. Biophiliology is perhaps a promising discipline. It is, and it's biased, right? He even uses the word biased in here somewhere. Let me finish this. So Wilson seems to be saying that the human mind flourishes and is most comfortable within the natural context in which it evolved. He has to make these empirical claims, right? They're startling empirical claims. And most of them, I don't see how you could verify them. How could you verify that the human mind flourishes better without having destroyed? I don't know. Biophilic conservationism is still essentially an anthropocentric selfish ethic, but Wilson claims that the biophilia hypothesis deepens our selfish motives for preserving land, air, water, wildlife. Okay? We should preserve land, air, water, ecosystems because these are necessary to human mental as well as physical flourishing. Stewardship of biodiversity is necessary for survival and flourishing of the human mind. Okay, and then we have all that stuff on there. Well, you can ignore all those last few slides. But where does he? Yeah, biased forms, right up there. The top quote there. Okay, it is time to invent moral reasoning of a new and more powerful kind. To look to the very roots of motivation and understand why we cherish and protect life. The elements from which a deep conservation ethic might be constructed include the impulses and biased forms of learning, loosely classified as biophilia. So especially if you're, any kind of science major, you might just think about that. That's kind of startling, isn't it? What on earth could he mean by that? Biased forms of learning, isn't that what we want to avoid? Why would we want to embrace a biased form of learning? Well, maybe what he's saying is that there is no non-biased form of learning. And in fact, so-called objective science that treats the world as nothing but a set of mechanisms is itself deeply biased. And perhaps a biophilic orientation toward the world that views living thing, that views nature organismically instead of mechanistically